Bonsoir, chers téléspectateurs. My name's Andrew Hussey, and I'm the Dean of the University of London Institute in Paris. I first came to the city as a teenager, and I've had a big connection with it ever since. Now, I live and work here. I still love the place, and I'm still fascinated by it. But these days, I travel around Paris not just for pleasure, but also to explore the places that inspire my writing about the city. But there's still one trip in Paris that I always make with a fair amount of trepidation. And that's here, to the Louvre. As you can see, the Louvre is big, brooding and vast. And to be honest, I've always been quite intimidated by this most massive of museums. But in this film, I want to change the way that I, and maybe you, see it too. So I want you to come with me on a tour of this extraordinary institution and to do a little bit of time travelling in French history. On the way, I'm going to try and make sense of a place that's jam-packed with over 35,000 pieces of art that you'll find in mile after mile after mile of galleries. It's a building that's over 800 years old and bursting with history. So come with me and see the Louvre transformed from a medieval fortress to a royal palace and then to a modern-day museum. We'll look at the great art of Da Vinci, Rubens, David and Gericault. We'll enjoy the glories of antiquity, and we'll explain why the magnificent artworks you can see today arrived in the museum and what they tell us about both the Louvre and France. I want to argue that if you know the secrets of the Louvre, know its history, know the glorious art within these walls, then I think you can understand France. The Louvre. Well, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of art here. So where to begin? Well, why not start with one of the oldest paintings in the museum? From the 15th century. A work of art with a gruesome subject that'll give us our first clue to the Louvre's long history. Look at this. This is a painting called La Crucifixion du Parlement de Paris. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Here in the foreground, for example, this bloke with his head in his hands, that's Saint Denis, who was one of the patron saints of Paris. Saint Denis was martyred in the 3rd century, beheaded on the high ground above the city, the present-day quartier of Montmartre. But his is not the only image of suffering. At the centre of the painting is Christ on the cross. On one side of him is the grieving Virgin Mother, comforted by Mary Magdalene. On the other, St. John the Evangelist. And this is art with a purpose. It was deliberately hung in the main chamber of the Parlement de Paris, a reminder to lawmakers to show due humility in the face of divine justice. But one other detail provides an insight into more earthly matters of bricks and mortar. This is the best approximation of what the Louvre would have looked like to medieval Parisians. What they saw was a fortress, a citadel of military power. The medieval Louvre was built strategically close to the River Seine, along the walls of the medieval city. A 30-metre tower looked out to the west and the enemy, the English, on a border sometimes only 45 miles away. The castle dominated the Parisian skyline, a very visible and very deliberate assertion of French power. On the outside of today's museum, there are a few clues to what lies underneath. The opening of a well and a cesspit. Below, there are the thick, strong walls and tall palisades that defended the Capetian and Valois kings of France from their enemies. This is the Louvre Entresol, the basement of the museum. And 30 years ago, excavations took place here which revealed these walls, which showed just how forbidding the Louvre was in its original medieval incarnation. Now, there's been a lot of debate over the meaning of the word Louvre, but I'm going to go with the old French term Louvre, which means fortress or stronghold, because I think that that pretty much sums up the place and its history. When the Renaissance came to France in the 16th century, this military fortress became a royal palace of great style and culture. In the museum today is the portrait of the man who began this transformation. This is Francois Ier, King of France, and the first great builder of the Louvre. It was painted around 1530 by the artist Jean Clouet. And it's a portrait of a real Renaissance man. He's a fighter, check out the hand on the sword, ever ready. But he's also a lover of culture. And so it's a picture of refinement, check out the tasteful clothes. He is every inch, as the French would say, a man à la mode. Francois Ier began the tradition that French kings should be both connoisseurs of art and patrons of artists. In 1516, he persuaded an elderly Leonardo da Vinci to leave Italy. The painting days of the great genius were over, but it's thought that he brought with him you know who. This painting, that millions come to see today, was the first ever work of art to enter the French royal collection.
Mona Lisa, Mona Lisa, men have named you.
Ah, Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa. That smile. That smile. Enigmatic, mysterious, tender, or mocking.
They have blamed you.
What is it about that smile? I asked the Louvre's curator of Renaissance art, Vincent de Lieuvin. The problem I've got with the Mona Lisa is that she's such a big media star.
Personnellement, qu'est-ce qu'il y a qui vous attire vers ce tableau, malgré la méditation?
What you have to do is to try and forget that she's such a big star and really get into the painting. Get up close and love it for what it is. And she definitely invites us to love her. It's such an incredible ability of the painter to portray that most difficult and subtle of human expressions, the smile. There are 1,000 ways of interpreting a smile, and that was the genius of Leonardo, to be able to capture such a subtle and rich human expression.
And she's such a flirt.
Of course she's a huge flirt. The French like that sort of thing, but hey, you're not completely untouched by her, are you?
Mona Lisa.
Now, what else is there left to say about this painting? Only that in the 16th century, La Joconde, as it's known in France, was something quite new in Western art.
Cette idée de créer un contact entre
The idea of creating a sense of contact between the viewer and the subject had never been done before. Or the open posture with her hands turned towards us. She's greeting us as if we were in her palace, in her room even. And it's even smiling at us. That technique of drawing the viewer directly into the painting was hugely innovative.
And is all this a new departure for Western art?
Absolutely. How many politicians' portraits have you seen in the style of La Joconde? Everyone uses Leonardo's style, from the framing to the posture to the direct approach of the subject to the audience.
So how influential was this approach to portraiture at the time? Well, let's go back to the portrait of François. Had its creator Jean Clouet seen the Mona Lisa? We don't actually know, but François does look us straight in the eye. His body's turned towards the viewer and his hands face the same way as Da Vinci's Florentine Lady. And as with her, we're drawn towards the personality of the king. François was not only a patron of the arts, but a builder of palaces. He'd spent some time in Italy, and he wanted to emulate the style of the Renaissance palazzi. So, the medieval tower was pulled down, moats were filled in, and a courtyard built, the Cour Carrée, overlooked by this imposing and ornamented facade. And within, the king demanded a makeover of gloomy royal apartments.
This is the Salle des Caryatides, and I think it's a place that best captures the spirit and feeling of the Renaissance Louvre. It's a vision of science and nature in harmony, and it signals the beginning of the French classical tradition. You can see its expression in the 4 sculptures by Jean Goujon, which give the room its name. These are the 4 Caryatides.
They have a function as pillars, but they're also works of art in themselves. Beautifully sculptured forms. Every curve and fold capturing a fleshy allure. And they stand sentinel to an elegant stairway that reveals to us yet another treasure of the Louvre. If we look around here, we'll see images also sculpted by Jean Goujon, and they give us pointers to the man who commissioned this passageway between the 1st and 2nd floors of the palace. He and his mistress have a love of hunting. And here, look at this letter H. That's a royal monogram, a kind of graffiti tag chiselled in stone. And the H stands for Henri II, who succeeded François II. Both within and without, every ruler who wanted to use the Louvre as a symbol of their power would leave their mark in this way. So, the walls read like an alphabet designed for posterity. The Renaissance Louvre was a place of great culture, but it was also the location for great violence during the infamous St. Bartholomew's Eve massacre. When religious war between Catholics and Huguenot Protestants threatened to tear France apart, the palace was witness to great horror that began with the most familiar of sounds from the nearby church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois.
In the early hours of the 24th of August, 1572, the sound of monks tolling the bell for matins could be heard as usual throughout the streets of Paris. But this particular morning, this normally reassuring sound was the cue for slaughter to begin, of Protestants by Catholics. Tuez-les tous was the battle cry. Kill them all.
Writer on the Louvre, Daniel Soulier, told me about the moment the very heart of power in France became a killing field.
These windows were the Queen's rooms. And so all the key decisions surrounding the St. Bartholomew massacre would have taken place just metres above where we're now sat. We know that many people were killed here in the courtyard of the Louvre. They were slightly hesitant to kill people in the actual royal apartments, so we imagine that they dragged a lot of people out here in order to kill them. There's another story that people tell, where the king at the time, Charles IX, sat in a balcony window with a crossbow, firing down upon Huguenots who were trying to escape on the River Seine.
There was a survivor of this terrible day in the Louvre, a Huguenot prince of the blood, Henri of Navarre. Days before the massacre, Henri had married the sister of Charles IX, Marguerite de Valois. 20 years later, the couple were King and Queen of France. The last Valois king had died childless, and Henri, next in line to the throne, became the first ruler of a new dynasty, the Bourbons. But to become Henri IV for all of France, and crowned as such in Paris, a deal needed to be struck. Henri would have to convert to Catholicism.
They passed through here, the Rue Saint-Honoré, which is just opposite the Louvre, heading for Notre Dame to hear Mass. And this was on the 22nd of March, 1594. He did this because, as we know, to give France peace and unity, it was worth a Mass. Paris vaut bien une messe.
A statue of Henri IV is on the Pont Neuf, which was itself completed in his reign to connect the right and left banks of the Seine. But the king was also determined to make his mark on the royal palace nearby. Henri wanted to link the Louvre to the recently built Palace of the Tuileries nearby. So to connect the two palaces, he ordered this built, the Grande Galerie. A name was now given to this grandiose vision of expansion, the Grand Dessein, the Great Plan.
As you can see, it's all conceived on the grandest scale. It's half a mile from there to there, for example. And the idea was that this is a place of entertainment and magnificent spectacle. You could come here, for example, to watch the water pageants on the Seine. But it's also a mystical space, a sacred space. It's where Henri IV and the Bourbon kings who came after him literally believed that they had the divine touch. They believed, most importantly, that they could cure people of the disease of scrofula, which is a really nasty kind of tuberculosis of the neck. What would happen is that the king would receive people and say, the king touches you, God cures you. Either way, I hope it worked.
Now there is a clue to Henri's life and loves in the Louvre. It's a painting that's not in one of the main galleries, where thousands gather to look at the usual suspects. But if you find this mysterious and striking work of art, you won't be disappointed. This is Gabrielle d'Estrées and her sister. Gabrielle d'Estrées was the mistress of Henri IV, and as they say, every picture tells a story. Have a look at the gestures. Gabrielle's sister is holding her nipple between thumb and finger, to indicate that she's pregnant with the king's son, the future Duc de Vendôme. And Gabrielle's also holding a bejewelled band of gold. It's not worn on her finger to symbolise a marriage, but it's thought to be the king's coronation ring, a token of his love and his loyalty. The two women are sitting in a bath, perhaps filled with milk or wine, as was the aristocratic custom. Both are beautifully made up to show off their white alabaster faces. Women of the time actually would crush up the innards of swallows and mix them with lilies, ground pearls and camphor, then smear the paste on their faces to get this ghostly look. This didn't seem to dampen the ardour of Henri, who couldn't resist Gabrielle. She bore him 3 other children before her sudden death in 1599. Henri's own life also came to an abrupt end, on the streets of Paris on the 14th of May 1610. One of his greatest achievements was to have guaranteed the religious liberties of Protestant Huguenots. But for such tolerance, he would never be forgiven by those who saw themselves as holy warriors for the true faith of Rome.
The fun-loving Henry came to a gory and violent end. That was here on the Rue de la Ferronnerie. This was where a religious fanatic called François Ravillac pulled back the blinds of the carriage that the king was travelling in and plunged a long knife 3 times deep into his chest.
The assassination of Henri left uncertainty over who would now rule France. Here's the story in paint of the woman who did. Here in the Louvre are 24 canvases devoted to the life of Marie de Medici, Henri's second wife. As regent, the Queen had many enemies. She needed to legitimise her grip on power. So she turned to the weapon of art and the greatest painter of the day, Peter Paul Rubens. I talked to curator Blaise Ducot about the biggest painting here showing the Queen's coronation.
Here, the first big impression is one of a great movement over towards the main focus of the painting, which is, of course, Marie de Medici in the process of being crowned in the Saint-Denis Basilica, the day before the assassination of Henri IV. You can even see him in the background, but very much recognizable, watching the Queen, and in the process giving her the sense of legitimacy that without she wouldn't have been able to govern and rule as regent.
This is painting on the grandest of scales. This is the art of the Baroque, with its extravagant use of movements and colour, and its feeling of sensuality. And all of this simply leaps out here.
It's a piece of theatre in many senses, and you have to look at it that way. They're very theatrical paintings, very Baroque. And of course, Rubens was the great Baroque painter.
And it was the sheer monumentality of the Baroque that fired the imagination of the next ruler of France to mould the Louvre in his own image.
This is the famous portrait of Louis XIV by Hyacinthe Rigaud. He was the Sun King, the l'état c'est moi champion of bling. He was the Bourbon who brought new levels of pomp and grandeur to the Louvre. But to my mind, there's something over the top, even desperately camp about this painting. Have a look at the big hair, the shoes, the clothes, the rich, rich colours. All of it seems to be screaming luxury and power. But after all, that's what it was all about.
During the early years of Louis's reign, the Louvre echoed to the sounds of thousands of labourers, masons and joiners working to create new facades, stuccos, elaborate carved ceilings and wood panelling. Work started on an imposing facade on the outside of the Cour Carrée. This colonnade would look out, and Parisians would look up to the palace with due deference and awe.
Here, in the Cour Carrée, Louis completed the building work begun by his father. He quadrupled the size of this courtyard to the dimensions you see today, and with one express aim, to make the Louvre a bigger and more imposing place.
and inside, a royal waiting room was built, the Rotonde d'Apollon, to wow impressionable visitors to the royal palace. Just off the Rotonde, a spectacular gallery was built, the Galerie d'Apollon, designed by the king's architect, Louis Le Vau.
And I'm looking around because everything here has got a kind of mythical or allegorical meaning, and all of that is literally revolving around the king himself. And just look at this place. It's splendid, it's glittering with all this gold glory. It really is, you know, the personification of what it means to be the Sun King.
Every image here reinforces the assertion that the king was godlike, the centre of the universe, looking down from high on a country where he, and he alone, had absolute power, with a rule over France that could never, ever be questioned by mere mortals. Unlike his illustrious predecessor Francois, Louis was not only a builder, but someone with a huge appetite for collecting art. The Charles Saatchi, if you like, of the 17th century. During his reign, the size of the royal collection expanded from 150 to exactly 2,376 paintings. He bought the best French art of his time, 32 Poussin, 11 Claude, 26 Lebrun, and 17 Mignard. And foreign masterpieces like this lovely but sombre painting, The Death of the Virgin, by Caravaggio. All now hang here in what was his Louvre.
The Louvre was a luxurious plaything for Louis XIV, but there was one big problem. It was in Paris, and he hated Paris. But funnily enough, the Parisians also hated him. So what happened in 1670 was that Louis XIV left Paris for Versailles in a great big splendid royal huff, and he hardly ever set foot in the place again. But he didn't leave empty-handed. He took all of his artworks with him.
With the exit of Louis XIV to Versailles, the Grand Dessin was put on hold. Much of the building work remained unfinished. The colonnade was left without a roof. Throughout the 18th century, the Louvre had a much more ramshackle feel to it, and it echoed to a more plebeian cacophony of sounds and voices.
The Grand Gallery changed from being the preserve of royals and aristocrats and became instead the centre for artistic hustling in Paris. This is where you'd find engravers hard at work, furniture makers, makers of the very finest hats. It was a place of great energy, bustle and commerce. But the most important thing that happened here was that by royal warrant, artists were allowed to come and live here, and they copied paintings. And then they made their own art. And this was the moment when the Louvre properly became a centre for cultural exchange in the endless carnival of Parisian life.
As the palace began to open its doors to vulgar outsiders, the presence of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in the king's former apartments still preserved a sense of decorum and gravitas in the Louvre. First in the Grand Gallery, then here in the Salle Carrée, the Academy held an annual, then biennial exhibition. Starting on St. Louis' Day, 25th of August, the salon was open to the public. The idea of showing art to all who wished to come was novel and proved fantastically popular. Events at the salon was something to be argued about in another institution, forever dear to all Parisians.
This was the first ever coffee house in Paris, opening to customers in 1686. From the word go, the Café Procope attracted intellectuals. In the 18th century, the great philosophe of the Enlightenment came here. And amongst them was someone very important to our story. Behind me here, this is Denis Diderot. Now, Diderot wrote penetrating critiques of the salon, and in doing so, he effectively invented art criticism.
and he threw down a challenge to artists with an ambition to impress him at the Salon.
First of all, move me, surprise me, rend my heart, make me tremble, weep, shudder, outrage me, and delight my eyes afterwards, if you can.
Diderot was delighted by one artist whose wonderful and poignant self-portrait you can find in the Louvre. And this is the painter, Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin. Chardin did this pastel drawing of himself when he was 76, and the infirmity of old age had stopped him painting in oils. In his still lives, Chardin was painting on a much smaller scale than a Rubens. And the canvases of Chardin have an apparent simplicity about them. But this art is not simplistic, and in these paintings, small, not big, is beautiful. The work of Chardin mesmerized Diderot, who saw something magical at work.
Oh Chardin, it's not white, red and black that you're mixing on your palette. It's the very substance of objects. It's the very air and light that you put on the tip of your brush and place on the canvas.
I talked to curator Marie-Catherine Sahu about Chardin and what he taught Diderot.
All Chardin's efforts went into the magic of turning the inanimate everyday objects into beautiful artwork. And for Diderot, I think, it was all about entering into the paintings and the mindset of Chardin and trying to find out what it was that made it so magical. The word magic is in fact used a number of times by Diderot, and Chardin taught him to go right up to a painting. That when you get up close to a painting, it ceases to have any significant meaning. It becomes just streaks of paint. And then, gradually, as you move away from it, everything slowly creeps into focus.
There's one painting of Chardin that I especially wanted to look at here. The one that's considered his masterpiece, the Ray. Yes, it's a still life, but with such energy and motion. Look at the cat about to pounce on the oysters. But what really draws the eye is the eviscerated form of the ray fish.
I think Chardin created a true character of the ray, personified in many senses with a seemingly tragic character. He uses the form of the ray, this triangular shape that you see, but also its whiteness to construct his painting. And then there's the semblance of a face that many people read into the painting, which is in fact neither the mouth nor the eyes, but the gills. It's a sort of anthropomorphic vision of this ray, which is, of course, also rather dramatic, with its insides coming out, reddened.
Whatever genius we now recognise in the still lives of Chardin, this style of art was seen by the Academy as inferior to the more high-minded genre of history painting. Works inspired by the past can be seen in the Salle Rouge, where hang the creations of one artist who in the late 18th century received the acclaim of the Salon, with paintings that look back to antiquity as a source of moral instruction to the present.
This is the self-portrait of the artist who features in the next part of our story. It's Jacques-Louis David, and it captures him at a bad moment in his life when he was in prison during the French Revolution. But the curious thing is the expression on his face. Is he angry? Is he frightened? Or is this the self-regard of the tormented artist? He was certainly vain enough, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
In 1784, David painted this, The Oath of the Gericault. And he did it for the man who'd given him a studio and lodgings in the Louvre, Louis XVI. It tells the story of three brothers sworn to defend Rome. Look at the outstretched arms reaching towards their father, who holds the weapons of war in his hand. And look at the way the picture splits in two, between its masculine and feminine characters. The style is simple, austere with sombre colours. The painting took the Salon of 1785 by storm, hailed as an instant masterpiece of neoclassical art. But what meaning did it have for the monarch who paid for it and for others who saw it? Everyone agreed it was a patriotic painting, but was there something more subversive going on here, addressed to those now seeing themselves as citizens? Because this was a painting whose message would change during a turbulent decade of French history.
Just under 10 years after David had painted The Oath of the Gericault, his patron the king was dead. He was sent to the guillotine here at Place de la Concorde, and this was the most shocking moment yet in the drama of the revolution that had begun with the storming of the Bastille. On a windy morning, on January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI mounted the scaffold, watched by thousands. There was a roll of drums, and then the 12-inch blade fell. As was the custom, the severed head, dripping with blood, was held aloft for display to the citizens of the First French Republic.
And so began the terror, when 18,000 men and women were sent to the guillotine. And David, now an elected deputy to the National Convention, was up to his neck in it. David voted for the killing of the king and eagerly signed arrest warrants so that others could go to their deaths. When Robespierre's great rival Danton went to his death, David was there, shouting out mockingly, "Le voilà le scélérat, c'est ce scélérat-là qui est le grand juge. Here, look at the criminal who thinks he's the big judge." David became Robespierre's cultural commissar. He demanded that artists be at the service of the people, the meaning of their art appropriated for the revolution. And David included his own art in this command. So, when his masterpiece, The Oath of the Gericault, was shown again, it was interpreted as a work of revolutionary virtue, with oaths to la patrie, much fraternité, and a taste for martyrdom. But what paintings like this needed was a public place to educate loyal citizens of the Republic. So David and fellow revolutionaries turned to an idea proposed by Enlightenment thinkers like Diderot, who'd advocated that a permanent exhibition space be created. A museum. So where?
On the 10th of August 1793, exactly 12 months after the fall of the Ancien Régime, the Louvre was declared Musée de la Nation, the People's Museum. And the ceremony took place here in the Grande Gallery. What actually happened was that all art in France was nationalised, all art, in fact, in the territories that France also had its eye on. So what happened really was that from the royal collection in Versailles, from churches, from aristocrats, from exiles, all art now belonged to the people, la grande patrie. This was brutal and necessary, argued the likes of David and his fellow revolutionaries. But what was really happening was a seismic shift in European history. This was the moment when art ceased to be the preserve of the rich and the wealthy and was really at the service of the people.
The new museum worked to the revolutionary 10-day week. The first 6 were reserved for artists who were at liberty to take paintings off the walls to copy, free to put chalk marks on the canvases. Then the Louvre was open 3 days to the public, with a last day for cleaning and repairs. And to add to the galleries of confiscated art, the Revolutionary Army was given the order to seize new treasures during their campaigns abroad.
On the 27th of July 1798, on the anniversary of the fall of Robespierre, an extraordinary procession of revolutionary booty from Italy made its way across Paris. And it ended up here, on the Champ de Mars. There were 80 wagons stuffed to the gills with books, manuscripts, rare plants and exotic animals. And there were also paintings from church and aristocratic collections, including Titian and Raphael, whose ultimate destination was the Louvre. On a banner proclaimed the slogan of the day, Ils sont enfin sur un terre libre. At last, they're in a free country.
Today, there are works of extraordinary beauty for us to enjoy in the Louvre, and all because of this revolutionary plundering. There are sculptures by Michelangelo, the dying and the rebellious slaves. They were taken from the Vatican in Rome. And from the Benedictine monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice was seized this vast canvas, the wedding feast at Cana by Veronese. Its life-size figures have been dominating the refectory for over 200 years. The painting was so big it had to be cut into two to make the journey by mule across the Alps. Vincent de Louvain knows the painting intimately.
When we take a step back and get a sense of the perspective, there are the columns reaching out at the back which give it amplitude. And of course there's the colour, the greens, the blues and the reds, all bouncing off and complementing each other. It's extraordinary. Across the painting, it's the little hidden gems that I love. All the little details. And there's even a musical performance going on here in the foreground. And there's a woman over here that's looking straight at us, as if flirting with us, next to the one picking her teeth. All of these amusing little bits and pieces. Even the slightly sterner men. You can see this chap over here who's holding himself very distant and severe. Those that look like they're about to fall asleep because of the alcohol. It's such a vibrant painting, almost noisy, if you will.
But in the end, what I find extraordinary is the figure smack bang in the middle of the painting. This is the haloed figure of Jesus Christ, with the Virgin Mary by his side, staring into space, oblivious to the revelry around him. Perhaps the message here is simple. All this pleasure around me is ephemeral. What I bring you is eternal. By 1798, when this booty reached Paris, the revolutionary ardour of David, indeed of France, had cooled. After the fall of Robespierre, David was arrested and put in prison where this self-portrait was painted. So perhaps this gaze shows a certain scepticism and distaste for the rough old trade of politics. But if David was anything, he was a survivor. And on his release, the painter was ready to ride the next wave of history. Time to offer his talents to the next strong man of France.
David found himself at the beck and call of a man who said that he didn't know much about art and architecture, but he did know exactly what it meant when it came to buffing up his image. This was a man who'd been a military hero during the revolution. Then after the coup d'etat that ended the Directory, he was a first consul. He was the despot who crowned himself emperor. Yes, Napoleon Bonaparte.
If you visit Napoleon's tomb here at Les Invalides in Paris, you can see enshrined in marble evidence that the Louvre was important to Napoleon.
Partout où mon règne a percé, il a laissé des traces durables de son bienfait. I love this. This is the celebration of Napoleon's public achievements. It's look upon my works, ye tourists, and be impressed. And on either side there's a list of everything that he's achieved as public works. And in the centre of it, there's les travaux du Louvre, the Louvre.
Once Napoleon had absolute power in France, he wasted little time in using the Louvre for the purposes of self-promotion. The dictator ordered that the Revolutionary Museum now be called the Musée Napoléon. And he had this mini and first Arc de Triomphe erected here in front of the Louvre on the Carrousel as a monument to his martial glory. On top were beautiful bronze statues of horses plundered from St. Mark's Square in Venice. Friezes celebrated Napoleon's many military campaigns. And there's this inscription dedicated to the Austrian campaign and the decisive French victory at the Battle of Austerlitz. Napoleon put his imprint on walls and ceilings with the letter N and his chosen images of bees and eagles. And he needed a painter to immortalise the most sacred moments of his life in the most sacred spaces. On 18th of December 1803, a proclamation declared, "Nous avons nommé Monsieur David notre premier peintre." Much to the immense self-satisfaction of David, he was now our first painter, and in 1804, we had a job for him.
Napoleon made sure that David, his court painter, witnessed the moment that he crowned himself emperor here in Notre Dame on the 2nd of December 1804. Originally, David had a ringside view for his sketching, but then the master of ceremonies, an aristocrat called Louis-Philippe de Ségur, who was very conscious of class and rank, moved David right up into the galleries, right high up, where he could neither see the procession nor, crucially, could he see the crowning. But when this happened, David exploded. He went mad. There was a fight, real fisticuffs. And it was only after this punch-up that David got his rightful place back. The rest, of course, is art history. But, you know, talk about an artistic temperament.
The finished work's in the Louvre. And it's a piece of work on a huge scale. But it's the detail that's important, and this is what preoccupied David and Napoleon when they met to discuss the painting. David captured the moment that Napoleon crowned Josephine Queen, not his own coronation. Her kneeling figure was copied from Rubens' Coronation of Marie de Medici. And by the way, she's had years taken off her by David's painterly facelift. Originally, David had painted the Pope with his hands folded in his lap, until the Emperor explained that he hadn't got the Pontiff all the way from the Vatican just to sit and do nothing. So David changed this to Pope Pius VII, blessing the coronation. And there's mischief here too. Look at the wily survivor Talleyrand and his turned-up nose. This is the man that Bonaparte famously called a piece of shit in a silk stocking. The female figure on the balcony, that's Napoleon's mother, who couldn't stand Josephine and actually wasn't there on the big day. But on instruction, David put her in the picture anyway. And there, of course, sketchbook in hand, is the great artist himself. Despite the success of this painting, There was a prickly relationship between David and the courtiers around the emperor. This picture was meant to be the first of 4 celebrating the coronation, but the project was never completed after squabbles about money. So it's perhaps no coincidence that in 1806, the great general gave David and fellow painters their marching orders. They had just 24 hours to pack up their studios in the Cour Carrée and get out. And when Napoleon married for the second time in 1810, David wasn't asked to record the ceremony when it took place in the Louvre. The close relationship between painter and despot was over as their fortunes declined. David to new rivals with new ideas about art, Napoleon to the hubris that led to his fall from power and the return of the Bourbon monarchy.
The rule of Napoleon was ended in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo, and the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty was secured. The Louvre was renamed Le Musée Royal, and all of the visual propaganda changed too. Out went the Napoleonic N and the bees and the eagles that had been his symbol, and in came the image of the lily and the monogram LL for Louis XVIII. And there was other interesting stuff. If you look up here, you can see that this is the face of Napoleon. What happened was that the new king had a wig placed on Bonaparte's head, transforming him into the image of his illustrious forebear, Louis XIV.
The restoration was a challenging period for the Louvre, forced to concede to demands that 5,000 pieces of plundered art be returned. The bronze horses on top of the Arc de Triomphe went back to Venice and were replaced by these grey imitations. Some treasures did remain. The wedding at Cana was kept, simply too big to be moved again, the museum argued. An elderly David was now in exile, like his former patron Bonaparte. But a new generation of painters was emerging and producing stunning works of art. One is to be found in the Salle Rouge.
This painting, Le Radeau de la Méduse, the Raft of the Medusa, by Gericault, is one of the great treasures of the Louvre. It was the talk of the Salon when it was first exhibited in 1819, and it was very quickly acquired by the then director of the Louvre, the Comte de Folbaum. I think it's an extraordinarily complex painting. It's realistic, but it's not quite real. You've got these human bodies constructed as a kind of pyramid. It's very romantic. It's about human suffering, but also about the impossibility of hope. But what you really feel is that you're in the painting, you're in that pyramid of human suffering. And you can see the kind of forensic nature of Gericault's work. He was the kind of man who spent hours in mortuaries and hospitals sketching out dead bodies, and he wasn't even afraid to take home the limbs to work out the tricky bits. And that's what makes this painting so stark, so powerful.
There was no bigger scandal than the shipwreck of the frigate Méduse off the West African coast, captained by the hapless Viscount Chaumarie. Of the 147 crew, only 13 survived. This was headline news, and the public lapped up lurid tales of cannibalism and madness. Such a juicy story translated to canvas could only be good for the career of the 20-year-old artist. I asked curator Sébastien Allard about the painting.
It was, and has been taken as a form of allegory, since Gericault is depicting a ship that was wrecked as a direct result of the incompetence of its captain. Survivors were stranded on a raft without food, water, or hope, and people took all this as an allusion to the French state after the fall of the empire, governed by incompetence.
There were more intense, romantic sensibilities at work here.
We can see here a taste for rather dark and sinister painting that's in stark contrast to the relatively clear and bright paintings of David. and which of course acts as a tool towards the dramatic effect of the painting. And it's a rather macabre style, with a penchant for death and corpses.
As well as bringing the best of contemporary art into the Louvre, these decades of the restoration saw the arrival from Egypt of mysterious and magical objects that were old yet very new.
On the 25th of October 1836, the great obelisk behind me here was unveiled. It came from a temple in Luxor and was the gift of the Khedive of Egypt. Its original base featured monkeys who had suspiciously large erections, and obviously this had to be replaced by something much more austere, in granite and fashioned in Brittany. But nonetheless, this latest monument was a great success. And the most important thing was that it announced a new mania in France for all things Oriental.
The man who arranged the passage of the obelisk to Paris, and who brought so much to the story of the Louvre, was Jean-François Champollion.
Now, Champollion worked here in the Louvre, and he established the superb and stunning collection that we see here today. But not only that, Champollion was the first person to decipher hieroglyphics, and in doing so, he invented the science of Egyptology.
Inspired by Napoleon's Egyptian campaigns, Champollion devoted his life to understanding this ancient culture. By the age of 16, he knew a dozen ancient languages, and with this extraordinary facility, he began the long task of deciphering hieroglyphs. In 1824, in the Précis du système hiéroglyphique, Champollion revealed that he had cracked these hidden codes. By this time, Champollion had persuaded the king to buy 3 private collections for the Louvre, and these were housed in a dedicated Musée Égyptien. When it opened, Champollion wrote an open letter to visitors, saying, "I'm thrilled just thinking about what I have to show you." And he was dead right to be thrilled. Along with statues of Egyptian pharaohs, there were religious artifacts and everyday objects. Today, we take these for granted, but in 1826, this was the shock of the new. We should pause to reflect on this moment in our story, because it signals another important transformation for the Louvre. Before, it was a palace with paintings. Now, it's what we recognise properly as a museum, full of works of art from all ages and cultures, and a place for scholarly investigation. In its way, this was a cultural revolution. And speaking of revolution, what had happened to the French taste for it?
After 15 years of monarchy, the barricades went up in Paris. For 3 days, between the 27th and the 29th of July 1830, there was street fighting across the city to challenge the autocratic rule of Charles X. Les Trois Glorieuses, as it was known in revolutionary folklore, is naturally commemorated here with this fine and thrusting monument at Place de la Bastille. But one young French artist wanted to do things his own way to commemorate this July Revolution. He wanted something more sweeping, more daring, something more epic. And what he did is in the Louvre.
"28th of July, Liberty Leading the People" by Gericault and Delacroix is to be found in the Salle Rouge. In 1830, Delacroix had written to his brother that he was taking on a modern subject, a barricade. "If I haven't fought for my country, at least I'll paint for her." The painting that emerged from his studio was the hit of the Salon. It's realistic. Delacroix used real people as models to depict real events, but it's also allegorical. was bare-breasted Marianne. Bayoneted musket in one hand, the tricolour flag of the Republic in the other, the personification of liberty and revolution. This Republican Amazon leads young and old and all classes to the barricades. Here the top-hatted figure of some means, and here the pistol-packing student. At their feet, the dead, a royalist National Guardsman, and this semi-naked figure, surely copied from Gericault's Raft of the Medusa, that Delacroix knew so well. And it all takes place against the smoking backdrop of Paris, the Republican flag hanging from Notre Dame in the distance. And the colours used here, red, white and blue, of course. There is perhaps no more iconic image in all of French history. And it didn't take long for the street-fighting men and women commemorated by Delacroix to be at it again. As Karl Marx observed, history was repeating itself. Revolution in 1848 was, in that very French way, followed by reaction. The nephew of Napoleon, Louis Bonaparte, came to power by coup d'etat that ended the short-lived Second Republic. And like his uncle, he declared himself emperor of a second empire. At the heart of this empire would be a city of grands boulevards and buildings built by Baron Haussmann. And the Louvre was to become the symbol of a modernised Paris. In 1852, a new Louvre project was announced that would complete the Grand Dessin by connecting both sides of the Louvre to the Palace of the Tuileries. The old tenement buildings and stalls that had been part of the site for centuries were bulldozed to make way for this vision of the future. The Louvre was once more to be a focus for political power. The emperor would rule from here. It would be the site of government, with bureaucrats in the new wings working away for France. And it would be a symbol of French cultural power, with its magnificent museum. The sheer ambition of this project was explained to me by Daniel Soulier.
We say in France that Napoleon really gave the full packet. It was a full-on imperial project. He threw limitless money, limitless people and limitless resources at it. The emperor had a hand in everything that happened in the Louvre, so all possibilities were open. He ordered that where the little town had sprung up here behind us, the Richelieu wing should be built, and the Denon wing on the other side over here. With these two new wings, he was able to enclose the space and create a courtyard of vast proportions right at the centre of the building.
Grandeur on the outside was reinforced by opulence within. Again, no expense was spared. Just look at all this luxury. The walls, the fittings, the carpets and the furniture. What does it remind you of? Yes, Louis XIV, and that was deliberate. This Second Empire style was a self-conscious and some said vulgar way of aping the Sun King. But Louis Bonaparte wanted everybody to know that his Louvre was as much a glittering reflection of his imperial eminence as any in the past. But the destruction of the old Louvre was mourned by one poet and critic. Charles Baudelaire was a regular visitor to the museum. It was a warm and comfortable place to meet his mother. He once took a 5-franc whore to look at the ancient statues. She professed to be scandalised by the nudity. Baudelaire was a great admirer and friend of Delacroix, who in 1851 had completed this ceiling in the Galerie d'Apollon. They were romantic soul brothers. Of the painter he wrote, Delacroix was passionately in love with passion, but coldly determined to express passion as clearly as possible. But while Baudelaire loved the art inside the Louvre with passion, he hated what had happened outside. In 1857, a collection of his poems was published, The Flowers of Evil. In it there's one poem, The Swan, which captures his melancholy over what had been lost here and elsewhere in Paris. The rickety tenements, the market stalls, and the poor in pocket but rich in heart.
Paris change, mais rien dans ma mélancolie n'a bougé. Palais Neuf. Paris changes, but in my melancholy nothing has moved. New palaces, blocks, scaffoldings, old neighbourhoods, everything for me is allegory, and my dear memories are heavier than stone. And so outside the Louvre, an image gives me pause. I think of my great swan, his gestures pained and mad, like other exiles, both ridiculous and sublime, gnawed by his endless longing. Et rangé d'un désir sans trêve.
Baudelaire had lost his beloved Paris, but the city created by Haussmann for Louis Napoleon is one that you can still enjoy today. And I, for one, never failed to be impressed by its scale, its straight lines and symmetry. But it wouldn't take long for the emperor to lose the capital, and with it his Louvre. In 1870, he entered into a disastrous war with Prussia. France was occupied and Paris put under siege. After military defeat, Louis Bonaparte left the Louvre for the last time and went into exile. In Paris, barricades went up for one final time as a commune was declared. The communards took control of the city in the spring of 1871.
At first, it was all done in a traditionally festive mood, en fête. On the 16th of May, the communards knocked down the mock Roman column here on the Place Vendôme that had been erected as yet another tribute to Napoleon's military exploits. Then, round midnight, the revolutionary fiesta moved on. Around 300 communards broke into the cellars of the Grand Hôtel du Louvre, where they helped themselves to the finest wines and smoked the most expensive and hugest cigars that they could find.
But these May days of hope were also accompanied by intense fighting around the Louvre. A civil war between left and right turned bloody. On the 23rd of May, the Palace of the Tuileries was set on fire and its dome blown up with explosives. The place that had been home to kings, queens and emperors burned for 48 hours. The destruction of the Tuileries left a gaping hole that created this skyline with its clear views all the way to the Arc de Triomphe. As for the Louvre, I think that this was a defining moment. The residence of royals and emperors, the Tuileries, had always been the symbol of autocratic rule to Parisians. Yet the Louvre was by now a different place in the eyes of the people, so it was spared the torch. Perhaps the presence of publicly available art guaranteed its survival. Why destroy the People's Museum? That would be vandalism. And by the time a Third Republic was established in the 1870s, there was much more to be enjoyed in the museum. There were wonderful new paintings donated by benefactors like the generous Duc de la Caze. One of these is the Club Foot, by Giuseppe di Ribera, a 17th century portrait of disability. The boy smiles and reveals his broken teeth. He looks us straight in the eye. He wants something. So look at his hand, holding a piece of paper, a begging letter. For the love of God, give me arms, it reads. And visitors could marvel at this fabulous marble statue, the Winged Victory of Samothrace, which had arrived from an excavation in the Aegean. Over 2,000 years old, it's a depiction of the Greek goddess Nike, thought to be celebrating a naval battle. She's got a kind of still beauty and grace, but a flowing drapery gives her dynamism and movement. I feel as if she could take wing at any time and fly through the miles of galleries. The Louvre was now established as a democratic space open and free to the public 6 days a week. And visitors from all over France and beyond were eager to visit this must-see part of the Paris experience. By the late 19th century, there was no question that Paris was the cultural capital of the world, and that the Louvre was the most potent symbol of this domination. By now, it was well established as a public space open to all who wished to visit. The artists of the day would congregate in places like this, Café La Palette, and the Impressionists were the most regular visitors to the museum, taking their inspiration from the past to look, learn and copy. Here in the Louvre is a pastel drawing by Degas, La Sortie du Bain. Here's a Monet. At the time, works like these were considered avant-garde, scandalous even, and as such were rejected by the Academy that still controlled the Salon. So these painters were forced to exhibit in a Salon des Refusés. Here's a Pissarro. He once said to Cézanne that he'd be glad to see the Louvre burned down. But Cézanne himself valued the museum. He wrote to a friend, "Keep the best company, spend your days at the Louvre," which is just what he did. Cézanne loved to contemplate the work of Chardin, his visual language, his depiction of nature, the simplicity of his composition. And all of this he put into his own work. But composers could be similarly inspired. Claude Debussy stood in front of this painting, Embarcation for Cythera by Jean-Antoine Watteau. Who wouldn't be captivated by the playful flirtatiousness of the couples? And who wouldn't be mesmerised by its mystery? Debussy saw all of this and wrote a piece for piano, L'Île Joyeuse. And writers too enjoyed the museum, not only as a place of culture, but also as somewhere to meet friends, and even sometimes to meet lovers. The Louvre was a place of amorous assignation for the American writer Edith Wharton. This is where she met her lover, the Paris correspondent of the Times, Morton Fullerton. They used to send each other secret notes in the Paris postal system. It was a kind of early 20th century form of text messaging. One from Edith simply said, "At the Louvre, 1 o'clock, under the shadow of Diana." And speaking of mysterious ladies, after all these many years, what had happened to you-know-who? The Mona Lisa remained in the royal collection until the Revolution. Then in 1800, Napoleon demanded that she join him in his bedroom at the Palace of the Tuileries. So not tonight, Josephine. But in the 19th century, La Joconde was back in the Louvre, now scrutinised by tortured aesthetes. That smile on her face was surely the oh so cruel and mocking pout of the femme fatale. Then, on 21st of August 1911, the painting was nicked.
The heist was both daft and daring. What actually happened was that a young Italian workman, a painter and decorator called Vincenzo Perugia, just walked out of the building with the Mona Lisa under his coat, presumably whistling a cheery aria as Italian workmen are wont to do. He took it back to Mamma Italia. Pandemonium broke out. The museum was closed for a week, the director was sacked, and 2 new guard dogs were appointed, Jacques and Milord. The whole of Paris had a right good laugh at the expense of a red-faced Louvre. New lyrics were set to favourite melodies which satirised the cheeky abduction, and these were sung in music halls and cabaret clubs across the city. One dirty ditty found the Mona Lisa in a place of ill repute. Mon poteau, embrasse-moi, je suis pas bagueule, mais je m'ennuyais beaucoup dans ces palais. Un soir que le gardien criait en ferme, j'ai répondu ta gueule, je suis carbattée toute seule. Which roughly translates as, hey mate, give us a kiss, I'm not fussy, but I was so bored in that palace. So one night when the guard cried closing time, I just said, fuck you mate, and scarpered.
The year the painting returned to the Louvre, after being found in Italy, was the first of a world war when a generation bled to death for France. Then in 1940, a second war erupted, bringing humiliation and occupation. And after that, there was the loss of empire. So after all of this, how to project the prestige of France in diminished times? Why, with art, of course. And the Louvre had a role to play in a piece of cultural diplomacy. In 1962, General de Gaulle decreed that the Mona Lisa should visit the USA. So La Joconde left Le Havre on the luxury transatlantic liner SS France in a first-class cabin cocooned in a waterproof container that would float if the boat sank. On her arrival in New York, she was received by President Kennedy like a head of state, before doing her duty for France and becoming a massive hit with the American public.
Monsieur Marot, I know that the last time the Mona Lisa was exhibited outside Paris, in Florence, a crowd of 30,000 people packed the gallery on a single day, while large crowds outside smashed the windows. I can assure you that if our own reception is more orderly, though perhaps as noisy, it contains no less enthusiasm or gratitude.
By the 1960s, and despite the treasures within, the Louvre was showing its age. It was stuck in the past. So perhaps that's why New Wave film director Jean-Luc Godard decided to shoot a sequence for his 1964 film Bon Départ there, to show his heroine Odile and would-be criminals Arthur and France attempting to beat the world record for running through the museum. Obviously, they're up for a bit of fun in the stuffy museum. But I also think this is an artful piece of satire by Godard, a quick critique of the French cultural establishment. So how could the museum get a new lease of life? Well, return to the idea of building again. Return to the spirit of the Grand Dessin.
In the 1980s, it was the creation of this structure behind me here which symbolised the transformation of the Louvre into a museum for the modern world. This is the glass pyramid designed by the American architect I.M. Pei. finished in 1989, is the most visible expression of the grand projet of the then President of France, François Mitterrand. And it's now the pyramid that defines the Louvre to the world.
The Louvre was perfect for Mitterrand.
The inauguration of the new entrance to the Louvre by President Mitterrand this afternoon means the public will now be able to...
Mitterrand was a politician with an acute sense of history and a vanity to match. When elected in 1981, he was looking for projects that would be lasting testaments to his presidency. His culture minister Jacques Lang suggested radical change for the museum.
Passons et repassons.
I was going past the Louvre every day, and I remember being shocked by the dirtiness of the place and its general state of disrepair, with all the dust covering everything. And I was shocked by the presence of a large car park right in the middle of the Cour Napoleon for all the civil servants. So in, I think, July 1981, I added a little note to Mitterrand titled Le Grand Louvre. I said to him, what if we totally completed the transformation from palace to museum?
If all things Egyptian were the shock of the new in a previous century, plans for a pyramid structure reflecting the ambitions of Mitterrand as a modern-day pharaoh created a storm. Le Monde's critic accused the government of turning the courtyard of the Louvre into an annex of Disneyland. Oh la la, quelle horreur! But I actually think that the Louvre came out of all this smelling of roses. This time, the modernists have won. When I look at the pyramid, I feel like I'm looking at a great work of modern art in steel and glass. Still, I'm curious to know what the Louvre's great pioneering Egyptologist, Champollion, might have made of this tribute to an ancient culture. And what strikes me in a city of most meaningful monuments is that this says we are a modern country. We are go ahead. Nous sommes la France très cool. But it's not only the outside that impresses. The pyramid illuminates a huge reception area underground. And new areas of the Louvre have been opened up to the shining light of culture, including the new Richelieu galleries in the East Wing, formerly occupied by the men from the Ministry of Finance. The palace would now be all museum.
I'm in the Cour Marly, and I'm surrounded by statues. This courtyard area used to be open to the elements, but now it's all glassed over, letting the light of the Parisian skies flood in. And that makes it a really comfortable and airy place to view art.
Visit today and you understand that the Grand Louvre project has been a runaway success. Before the 80s, 2 million people visited the Louvre every year. Now, the figure's closer to 9 million. And this grandest of Grand Projets continues. In September 2012, a new gallery opened to house the riches of the museum's collection of Islamic art. Here are 3,000 works in 3,000 square feet of exhibition space. All housed in the most radical piece of architecture to grace the museum since the pyramid. There's a wonderful elusiveness to the Islamic Gallery's roof and ceiling. Is it a golden veil, undulating sand dunes, or perhaps even a flying carpet? Under this covering there are great treasures. With Islamic strictures against representations of the human form, everyday objects become art. A candlestick adorned with ducks, a perfume burner in the shape of a cat, both from 11th century Chardin in Central Asia. And these calligraphic delights with their messages from the past. A lamp that shines the wisdom of Islam. A 9th century vase with a love letter written on its side. And a plate from Samarkand with an inscription which reads, "At first, magnanimity has a bitter taste, but in the end, it feels as sweet as honey." And in the lower galleries, I'm looking for a special work because it gives us one last reminder of this story of the Louvre. And here it is, the Baptistère de Saint-Louis, a masterpiece in brass, inlaid with gold and silver. It was made in Syria in the 14th century, the work of Muhammad ibn al-Zayn. It's beautiful in its detail. And here, a coat of arms seemingly hammered on at a later date. This is the fleur de lis of the Bourbon kings. How this extraordinary object got into their hands is not known, but it was used to baptize Louis XIII, son of Henri IV and father of the Sun King, those great builders of the Louvre. And it made its way to the museum in 1793, confiscated from the royal collection by David and the revolutionaries.
But for all this magnificent art, there's also a much bigger picture. This shows that the museum is sensitive and aware, building a bridge between France and the Muslim world. And this fulfills France's historical role as an influence there, une puissance musulmane. So, another canny piece of cultural diplomacy to project just the right image of France in today's world.
But let's end where we started, with the word, with a medieval word, Louvre, meaning stronghold. Because when I began this journey, the Louvre did feel very much like a cultural fortress. But time travelling through its art and history, what I've tried to do is open it all up, literally to l'ouvrir le Louvre. And in the process, I've come to realise that there's another word which sums the place up much, much better. And this is a very French one, very Gallic. La gloire.
Now, this is a word which is a little bit difficult to translate into English, but what it's about is power, splendour and beauty. And that, for me, cher téléspectateur, is the real treasure of the Louvre, buried deep here in the heart of Paris.